Top 5 Real Crime Stories, Stranger Than Fiction. The morning of June 10th, 1912, dawned over Villisca, Iowa. Like any other summer day, sunlight spilling over the rows of white wooden houses, and the smell of fresh-cut hay drifting through the air. But by mid-morning, the town would never be the same again. At 8 a.m., a neighbor named Mary Peckham grew uneasy. The Moore house, usually alive with the sound of children's laughter, was unervingly still. No one had come out to tend the chickens. No one had drawn the morning water. The curtains, tightly pulled, hid whatever was inside. Mary knocked on the door. Silence. She tried the handle lock. Circling to the back, she called out for Josiah Moore, the father of the family. But her voice vanished into the quiet. Something was wrong. When Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, arrived with a spare key, they stepped into darkness. Every blind was drawn. Every lamp was extinguished. The air was heavy, suffocating like the house itself was holding its breath. Ross moved slowly toward the parlor. On the floor, beneath blood-stained sheets, lay two small shapes. He froze, realizing what they were: the Stillinger sisters, guests of more children who'd stayed the night after church. The panic that followed would echo through Villisca for generations. Within hours, Sheriff Hank Horton arrived, his boots creaking across the warped wooden floor. The first thing he noticed was a smell of sharp metallic rot. Each step revealed something more horrifying. Upstairs in their beds lay Josiah and Sarah Moore. Across the hall, their four children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, all gone. Each struck again and again by an axe that now leaned against the bedroom wall, its handle slick and dark. Every mirror in the house had been covered with cloth. The victims' faces, too, were concealed as if the killer couldn't bear to look at what they'd done. On a chair near the bed, Sheriff Horton found something stranger still: a piece of uncooked bacon wrapped in a towel, next to a bowl of bloody water. The town doctor, Dr. F.S. Williams, removed his hat and whispered. Not a single one of them woke up. Outside, word spread like wildfire. Neighbors gathered at the gate, their faces pale with disbelief. Farmers from miles away rode in just to see the house where the unthinkable had happened. By noon, the crime scene was trampled by onlookers, some taking souvenirs: a scrap of Josiah's shirt, a splinter from the bedpost. The evidence was ruined before it could even be collected. By evening, Villisca was in a frenzy. Reporters flooded in from Des Moines and Chicago. The Des Moines Register called it the most mysterious and brutal crime in Iowa's history. Theories began immediately. Some said it was revenge that Josiah Moore had made enemies after leaving the John Deere Company to start his own business. Others whispered it was religious retribution, linking the timing to a traveling preacher who had spoken about sin and salvation just hours before the murders. Then came the strangest detail of all. On the edge of Josiah's bed, detectives found the axe blade wiped clean, the handle glistening as if polished. Whoever did this had taken their time killing methodically, room by room, without a single neighbor hearing a scream. But the killer didn't stop there. On the kitchen table, a lantern with a chimney removed sat turned low, dimming the light enough for the murderer to move silently through the rooms. The clock on the wall had stopped at 12:45 a.m., frozen in time like the house itself. When Sheriff Horton questioned townspeople, everyone had seen something or thought they had. A stranger with a limp, a drifter seen near the train tracks, a man carrying a black bag at midnight. Yet, none of it led anywhere solid. The first suspect was Frank Jones, a wealthy businessman and Josiah's former employer. Rumor had it Josiah had stolen clients, and worse, that he'd been too close to Jones's daughter-in-law. But Jones had power, influence, and an alibi. The whispers stayed whispers. Then came Reverend George Kelly, an English-born traveling preacher who'd left Villisca by train at dawn on June 10th, hours after the murders. He was odd, nervous, and obsessed with the case, even writing letters to police offering to help solve God's mystery. But there was no proof, not yet. Days turned into weeks. The Moores were buried side by side in a single ceremony attended by hundreds. The children's small coffins were laid before their parents, the church bells tolling across the fields. But even as the funeral ended, new evidence emerged: a message scrawled in pencil on a scrap of paper found near the back door. No one knew who wrote it, But the word sent chills down the sheriff's spine. Whosoever doeth wrong shall receive the wrong which he hath done. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, as though written by someone on the edge. Sheriff Horton locked it in an envelope and whispered, "This isn't over." But when investigators finally opened the attic, expecting silence, they found something that froze them in place. Dust disturbed. Footprints. A half-eaten piece of food still fresh. Someone had been living inside the Morehouse, watching them for days before that night. And whoever it was still out there. The discovery in the attic changed everything. For weeks, people in Villisca whispered that the killer had been inside the house long before family ever went to sleep, moving through the shadows, breathing in their lives one quiet night at a time. But there was one man who seemed too fascinated by that idea. Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with thin mustache and a nervous blink, couldn't stay away from the story. Kelly had preached at the Villisca church on the very night of the murders. Witnesses remembered him as anxious, erratic, and talking too fast. But no one thought much of it then. When the Moore family was found dead, Kelly left town early, long before the news broke, boarding the 5:19 a.m. train to Macedonia, Iowa. He said he couldn't sleep that night. He said the Lord had told him to go. But when investigators found his name in a hotel ledger, just hours after the murders, the timeline began to twist. Kelly didn't just leave Villisca, he fled. By late June, the investigation had turned into a spectacle. Newspapers called it Iowa's House of Horror. Locals refused to lock their doors before. Now, they barricaded them at night. Farm dogs barked at every sound. Neighbors stopped speaking after sunset. Detectives began chasing leads across the Midwest to Kansas, Illinois, even Nebraska, tracing whispers of similar axe murders in nearby towns. In each case, the killer struck at night. Whole families. No robbery. No clear motive. And in each case, a train ran nearby. That pattern drew attention to a chilling theory that the murderer might be a railway transit, someone hopping trains and vanishing before daylight. A killer without a home, without a trace. But Sheriff Horton wasn't convinced it was random. He believed the Villisca murders were personal, almost ritualistic. That theory grew stronger when a reporter from the Des Moines Daily News received an anonymous letter postmarked from Kansas City. It read, "I've seen the house. The Lord has sent me visions of blood upon the walls. They must be cleansed." The handwriting matched Reverend Kelly's sermons. When detectives found him, Kelly was living in a rented room in South Dakota, surrounded by newspaper clippings of the Moore family and typewritten confessions to crimes that hadn't happened. When questioned, he told the detectives, "God woke me that night and told me to walk the streets of Villisca. I saw the house, I saw shadows at the window. The devil himself was there." Detective James Rice, who led the interrogation, leaned forward. "Did you go inside, Reverend?" Kelly smiled faintly. "I was invited." The room went silent. Police searched his belongings. Inside his suitcase, they found the typed confession letters someone signed, others bearing his own name. But what shocked them most was a postcard he'd written and never sent. It read, "The spirits of the children will not rest. The axe has spoken. The sins of man are finished." Investigators thought they had their man. Kelly's obsession with religion, his fixation on sin and punishment, his presence of Villisca, that night it all lined up too perfectly. But just as the evidence seemed to close in, a new detail cracked the case wide open again. A farmer from the outskirts of town came forward. He claimed he'd seen a tall, broad-shouldered man walking along the train tracks near Villisca at 2 a.m., carrying something heavy over his shoulder. When the farmer called out, the man didn't turn. Instead, he disappeared into the cornfields, heading toward the depot. The man was not Reverend Kelly. Still, prosecutors decided to make an example of the preacher. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, George Kelly was arrested and charged with 8 counts of murder. His trial became a national sensation. Reporters flooded the small courthouse, sketching his trembling hands and feverish eyes. The prosecution presented his bizarre letters, his erratic behavior, his supposed confession where he described how the victims were killed. Kelly said he'd seen it all in dreams. But when the defense argued that Kelly suffered from schizophrenia, the jury hesitated. They couldn't prove he was in Villisca, at the exact time of the murders. They couldn't even prove he owned an axe. After 2 trials, Kelly was acquitted. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted not in joy, but in disbelief. To them, the verdict meant one thing. The killer of the Moore family was still out there. Years passed. The case grew cold. But the story didn't die. Every new sheriff, every new generation of detectives reopened it, hoping for something, a fingerprint, a clue, anything that might make sense of the horror. In the 1920s, a retired detective named Wilkerson reopened the file, convinced that the murders were part of a string of axe killings that stretched across the Midwest. In every town, the killers struck the same way families in bed. No forced entry. Lamps dimmed low. He called it the Axeman Trail. But then, just as Wilkerson prepared to publish his findings, his office caught fire. All his notes burned. No cause ever found. To this day, some say the killer or someone protecting him silenced the truth. In Villisca, the Moore house still stands. Locals say that on quiet nights, when the wind sweeps through the cornfield, you can hear the faint squeak of footsteps upstairs, like someone pacing, waiting, not haunting, just hiding. Because the truth about that night in 1912 was never buried. It was only covered up. More than a century later, the Moore house still stands, the white 2-story farmhouse at the edge of town. It's been repainted, restored, preserved. But inside, the air still feels heavy. The clocks have long stopped ticking. The curtains remain drawn, and the upstairs floorboards creak beneath anyone who dares to enter. Tourists come from across the world to see it, to stand in the same hallway where an entire family lost their lives. Some claim to feel cold drafts. Others swear they've heard whispers or seen shadows that don't belong. But beyond the stories, one truth remains. The killer was never found. And yet, in the years since, a few clues have begun to resurface, fragments of evidence once thought lost to time. In 2006, historian Ed Eppley, who'd spent decades studying the case, uncovered an overlooked police report buried in an Iowa archive. It described footprints leading away from the house, through the backyard, toward the train depot. Bare footprints, a man-sized 1 foot slightly dragging, as if injured. This small detail reignited an old theory, the idea that the Villisca killer was not a preacher, not a neighbor, but a traveler. Detectives in 1912 had already noticed a disturbing pattern. Beginning in 1911, a string of nearly identical axe murders swept across the Midwest, Illinois, Kansas, Colorado. Families slaughtered in their beds, mirrors covered, lamps turned down low, no robbery, no motive. The method was the same, the silence the same, the brutality identical. It was as if a phantom moved from town to town under cover darkness, killing by habit, then vanishing into the next sunrise. Retired Detective James Wilkerson, who tried to prove this link in the 1920s before his files mysteriously burned, had focused on one suspect, a transit man named Henry Moore, no relation to the Villisca victims. Henry had worked on railroads across the region. He'd served time for assault and had been spotted in multiple towns just before families were murdered. In December 1912, 6 months after Villisca, he was arrested in Columbia, Missouri, for the murder of his mother and grandmother.